And so she woke up from where she was, lying still, said, I gotta do something about where we're going. Step on a steam train, step out of the driving rain, maybe run from the darkness in the night, singing ah la 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 de day, ah la 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 de day, ah la la de sweet the sin, bitter the taste in my mouth. I see 7 towers, but I only see one way out. You gotta cry without weeping, talk without speaking, scream without raising your voice. You know I took the poison from the poison stream, then I floated out of here. Singing, ah la 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 de day, ah la 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 de day, ah la la de day. She went through the streets with eyes painted red, under a black belly of cloud in the rain. In through a doorway, she brings me white golden pearls, stolen from the sea. She is raging, and the storm blows up in her eyes. She will suffer the
What is that?
I'm not sure. I suspect it's an anemone.
to stand.
I can never pronounce that. Anemone? Or is it anemone? Is this bear grass?
Yep. That's bear grass. See? 3 leaves and 3 petals. Trillium. There won't be any more violets. They need the sun. Oh, a calypso orchid. See? If you pick them, they die. The whole plant dies. I don't know why it's called that.
Called what?
Rattlesnake orchid. Goodyear arcans. They're very common. See the amazing heart-shaped leaf?
Mm-hmm.
You can actually use that in cooking. It was at the native garden at the university, but it was bloomed out. Well, there's another wild ginger in there.
Wild ginger.
See the heart-shaped leaf in there? It's kind of
yeah,
hard to
right.
see unless you're wildly crazy like.
You picked that up on your way out or something?
Yeah. This is evergreen huckleberry.
Evergreen huckleberry?
Yep. exotic blue flowers or delphiniums.
What?
See the bumblebee?
Oh yeah.
Food stuff for the evening. Right on the water.
Oh yeah.
It's either that or butterfly.
Do you often go to other people's gardens and weed their gardens?
Yes. Quite the obsession. Wow. Wonder. This kid's a little camera shy.
This patch right here, that's all Siberian iris.
Oh, neat.
MCAT playground. And all kitty witties should have a playgroundy roundy to play way in.
You know what this is? This is a carrot.
It's a what?
A carrot.
It's a carrot? What's a carrot doing in the flower garden? That's too bizarre.
They make beautiful flowers. I always have carrots in my garden.
And there's, of course, the killer rhubarb. Not to be outdone by the killer comfrey. Which has a name that I can't remember, but it's an herb. The commercial celery plant was taken from this herb. The leaves all taste like celery. They're great in green salad. The garden is sort of like a public space. I think that plantings we've put out in their wildness attract some attention. It's interesting. Occasionally I catch a few relatives who come by and look over the place, look over the plantings, look over the gardens from a distance, from the walk or from driving in the alley. Well, I haven't talked to them in years. You know, it's one of those situations where you don't talk to your relatives and they don't talk to you. Sort of intra-family dysfunction, but it's nice to have these gardens so that your displaced and uninterested relatives can come by and take a look. Yeah.
We want to get my face on there? Hi.
Sure.
What you doing? Want some witty comment?
Yeah.
I'm fresh out of them.
Say something about the plants. Or
The plants? Well, it's a great variety. You must have 100 different species. You put them in every year, they all biennials.
Well, they're all perennials.
Perennials, yeah. Oh, okay.
Perennials. Periannuals.
Perennials?
Perennials. It's hard to keep track of all that stuff.
Right.
There are people that are experts about that,
but they never tell us what they know.
yeah, I'd like to get a botanist over here.
Yeah, and inform us of
Yeah,
everything.
you could tell me about the
They
botany.
Right.
Of the-
They just tend to ignore us.
Right. Well, they're academicians, you know.
Right.
They need to stay in the ivory tower.
Right.
The ivory tower, incidentally, is less than 1/2 block from here.
Really?
Yeah.
That's handy.
It's
Do you get any free advice over there, or do you?
no.
They lock the door when they see you coming, huh?
Well, yeah, and there's probably good reason for that.
Oh, rumor gets around quick, and they'll stop and
Yeah,
rumor.
well, there have been a lot of rumors that there have been rumors floating around,
Oh, really?
and I've been trying to figure that one out.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, recently I've been to major meetings in which hundreds of people are called in to discuss rumors.
Really?
Yeah.
And they don't solve anything.
Yeah,
I guess.
it has to do with people being employed by local Missoula companies that decide that in order to save money they need to cut wages, and
Oh, okay.
a lot of that going on in Missoula.
Is that happening down here? That makes life difficult if you're on the
Yeah,
other end of things.
this is true because It's like working for welfare. That's what it is.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, I mean, if everybody who's in this situation could quit working for them and somehow get on welfare, they'd make the same per hour
Right.
that they make by
They
working.
they might even make more.
Yeah, well, that's probably true.
Really.
It's
It's not exactly one of those fair things in the world.
this is
Sure, I mean, it makes sense. No, because it could
And on
never...
your tombstone, it'll say, Paul. with the date, owned one lousy car his whole life.
No, but that's why I ask what your objective is, because that's the truth. And if you think about it, of course it makes sense, because how much does it cost to make payments to the bank? It costs between $3,000 and $5,000 a year.
Right.
Have you ever owned a car that costs you $3,000, $4,000, or $5,000 a year to fix? Never.
No.
So it's always less expensive.
Oh, you never owned a Volvo.
Or a Peugeot. So it's always less expensive to fix, no matter what it is. So that's why that's probably not your real objective.
Well, no, it isn't. I mean, it certainly is a question of luxury is some need. Obviously, I wouldn't have bought the car I bought.
Are you happy making the payments that you're currently making?
Good question. I'm alive. Of course I'm not. No, it's not a real problem.
It's not a real problem. I think you could probably wangle a new one and keep the payments the same almost.
Well, there's no question you could do that. You could make payments for the rest of your life and always own a reasonably new car. But it's $300 or $400 a month.
Right.
Boy, $300 or $400 a month. Think of how many trips to Honolulu that you don't want to
He
go.
doesn't wanna go to Honolulu.
You live in Miami.
Yeah, right.
Think of all the trips. You could be sitting by the fountain of Trevi right now, drinking espresso, with all the money that you're blowing on making payments.
Yeah, then you'd come back and that same old junk would be sitting in your driveway.
Yeah, but
Go-
memories are the only paradise from which man cannot be driven.
And a new legend.
And a new legend.
Paul, buy the new legend. You'll love it. It's really nice, too.
That was heavy.
They've changed it.
Yeah, I know. I looked at it already. That's what's part of my problem.
Yeah.
And our auto masters, I guess, masters of auto enlightenment, Tom and Ray Magliazzi, member station WBUR in Boston. Thanks a lot, I think, guys.
We're not sure either. Bye, Leanne.
Hi. Hey, little squirrel.
See
There.
how blue the foliage is on those roses?
Yeah.
Those are called the blue foliage roses, rubrifolia. This looks like saxifrage. Either
What is it?
saxifrage or endostace.
These purple ones?
Yeah, the little purple jobs. Isn't that an awesome color? Too much shade for it right now. These are little native bluebells, Mertensia. See the little Mertensias? I'm not sure what species. I'm not familiar with that species. Oh, and those are Doug firs. They're native. This is called horsetail, and it is a real problem. in
What's
the garden.
horsetail? This?
This stuff, if you were 60
This-
million years old, you would be pretty tough too. It's one of the oldest plants known on
Oh, really?
Earth.
Horsetail?
Yeah, Equisetum. This is a little dinky This one actually is the prettiest flower out here. That's Enothera caspitosa. There are a lot of those around Great Falls. And the blue phlox, these are really a lot of them are found in Great Falls too. Lewis and Clark mentioned them, seeing them when they went through.
Are they native?
Yes, they are. They're named for Lewis. And these are penstemons, but they don't look very pretty.
What
And
are?
there's some penstemon nitidus over there, but they look even sicker.
This is phlox, blue phlox.
Yeah, right here. This is blue phlox, and they're always moving all the time. These are called pussy toes. Do you see how much it looks kind of like a pussy toe?
Oh, okay.
They're also called antinaria. I think these are senecio over here, these yellow critters. That's my guess anyway, a senecio.
Is there butterroot in here?
No, I don't see any. Now these over here are really a poor example of a nitidus, penstemon nitidus. They come from around Great Falls, and they're much more spectacular than that. They don't look like they're very happy here. Those are nitidus also, but they're a really sick color. This is the low one around Great Falls, the Delphinium bicolor.
Which one is that?
With the blue flowers?
Oh, okay.
Looks like a carpet.
No, the carpet is phlox.
Oh.
There's actually a rare and endangered phlox called Phlox missouliensis.
And it actually puts the entire field on its head. And in the end, I want to conclude that we really don't understand why these agents work, or at least we don't fully understand it. And you can see here that in TPA, there are 400 such events compared to 468 in the streptokinase group. And since abscess really is a clone of streptokinase, the fact that, again, this is high compared to this seems to support the general comparison of streptokinase versus TPA. And you can see it's seen whether or not you give heparin, see aspirin alone and no heparin, so absolutely no heparin. Yet TPA had a lower reinfarction rate compared to streptokinase and also in the presence of heparin. And the same results were seen in GC. It just does not fit our concepts of how this agent works, or supposed to work. Now, side effects of greater severity, these are not minor side effects, but major side effects are plotted here. There is undoubtedly more allergic side effect with streptokinase and abscess compared to TPA. 43 versus 12 and 76 versus 12. You can see in every single respect, actually, abscess comes out to be the biggest loser in this three-way comparison. Profound hypotension, again, lower with TPA, but still occurs with TPA. People think you don't get hypotension with TPA. That's incorrect. And you can see that. Now, major bleeds are identical, and major bleeds is defined as major bleeds requiring at least 1 unit of blood transfusion. So you can see here about 1% in the three groups. So we're not getting any real advantage with TPA except for a lower incidence of reinfarction. And I believe that is entirely true because we've seen it in 2 trials. And in fact, we did a meta-analysis of all the trials of TPA versus placebo. And even there was a lower incidence of reinfarction in the actively treated group compared to the placebo group. And this is something that nobody has explained. Now, what about the patency rate? This is the Genentech TPA regimen, and you can see overall there's a 72% patency rate in the 5 studies where you have the data, with confidence limits of 67 to 77%. Here are 3 studies with the TPA regimen used in ISIS-3, and you get 69%. So 72 versus 69%, they're really almost identical. So both the data on patency, on ejection fraction, side effects, and mortality suggest that the 2 TPAs are the same, and the data from the 2 trials suggest that are very consistent and show that other than a difference of reinfarction in favor of TPA, everything else is either neutral or harmful with TPA. Now, the background to interpreting these data are, first, we do know that antiplatelets halve the rates of reinfarction from ISIS-2. So we already have a very effective agent on board. The second is that there are fewer reinfarctions in the existing data with TPA compared to streptokinase. So if you felt that the heparin that was used in ISIS-3 and GC2 was inadequate, if anything, a more intensive heparin regimens got to be better for streptokinase rather than for TPA. Just doesn't stand to reason. then since you have already more hemorrhage with TPA, if you give a more aggressive regimen of heparin, there's no way you're going to reduce that hemorrhagic risk. It may be constant, but it's quite likely it's going to be higher. So and then looking at strokes, especially intracranial bleeds, again, it's possible that either more aggressive TPA regimens, for instance, faster infusions, higher doses, or whatever, or more aggressive heparin, is likely to increase that. In fact, there are indirect data that do suggest that at higher doses of TPA or faster infusions, you're going to get that. So that changes in the TPA regimen, while it might produce greater benefit, might also produce greater harm. So that both those parts of the equation have to be considered. Now here is a summary of the trials comparing TPA versus streptokinase. The data on patency at 90 minutes do undoubtedly suggest that TPA is superior to streptokinase in opening out arteries. There's no doubt about that. We're not arguing about that. But the data also suggests from a number of studies that at 24 hours, there is no difference. So somewhere between 90 minutes and 24 hours, the curves come together. But there is very good data, both the direct comparisons and the indirect comparisons, where plenty of heparin was used, that there's no difference in LV function between these two, at least as measured by ejection fraction. Again, mortality, both direct comparisons and indirect. And direct comparisons, I say 21,000, this was before ISIS 3, now you can add another 40,000 to that. Again, no difference. Strokes, both the direct comparisons and the indirect comparisons suggest more with TPA. And major bleeds actually suggest no difference, although the early data from GCD seem to suggest there were more with streptokinase. So what you see is a consistent pattern that's emerging. And the only thing inconsistent is that our preconceived notions of how thrombolytic agents should work is not being fulfilled. But the data are consistent. Right, now I want to go on to the second question, which I think really is the more interesting question. I mean, if we all agree that a thrombolytic agent works, then, and they're almost equally effective, I mean, I care less about which agent you use, but I care more whether or not you use it, and whether or not you use it in the right patients. I mean, the only difference between choosing between TPA and streptokinase is in cost, and hell, America is a rich country and wastes a lot of money anyway. Now, if, you know, in India I wouldn't use TPA, and I'm sure Dr. Shah wouldn't either in India, but that's a different issue. So who needs streptokinase? The main areas of uncertainty is ST elevation versus the rest. We all agree that people with ST elevation need it, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but I'm going to talk about the other ECGs. And the delay. The other issue, for instance, is the issue of age. Can you give it to all people and benefit, or are you going to produce more harm? So those are the areas I'm going to deal with. And in order to deal with it, I'm not going to focus on just one trial. I'm going to bring the world literature together. And we have 50,000 patients from all these major studies. So here is the data. Now, the denominators will change slightly because not all trials gave me the data the way I wanted it, but here are the data. This is the sum total, about a 12% mortality down to 10%. I want you to notice, the first thing I want you to notice is these curves. It's very hard for you to look, to see this on the small screen. And this pointer is on the blink. Do we have another pointer? Okay. I'm going to walk up here because I want you to notice a very important finding, which I'm going to expand on in the next few slides. This is the active group, and this is the control group. But notice what happens on the first day. There are more deaths in the active group compared to controls. Notice on the second day, the same thing happens. It's only around the third or fourth day that the curves cross over and you're starting to see benefit. This difference of early death is highly significant in excess of thrombolytic therapy. And this, I think, is the biggest contribution of the trials. There is an unexplained hazard of thrombolytic therapy that we've never guessed before. Now here are the data in greater detail. On the first day, there are 550 deaths in the treated group compared to 415 in the control group. Again, a 32% excess mortality that you put half a dozen zeros before your one on the p-value. So this is real. It's there in almost all the trials, but nobody expected it, so nobody looked for it. This, on day 1, the next day, day 0 is the day when patients come in. And remember, when patients come in, it's half a day, because people come in from time 0, early in the morning, till midnight, so the average time is half a day. So in the first 12 hours, we're getting this big excess. Then things start to go in the favorable direction, and that's when you start seeing the benefit. So in trying to understand the mechanism of action of thrombolytic therapy, it's useful to look at the early hazards separately from the late benefits. Okay, now I'm going to show you the data first for by ECG, by age, and by time overall, and then by splitting out the early hazards, because there are some important messages there. First, ST elevation, we all agreed works. So what about bundle branch block, ST depression, and others? Thank you. Here is the data in the 13,000 people without ST elevation. There is no difference in mortality. If anything, the treated group has a slightly higher mortality than the untreated group. So this is at least an open question, and certainly at the moment for most patients who don't have ST elevation or bundle branch block, and I'll come to bundle branch block in a minute, one should withhold therapy with thrombolytic agents. There is an extension of this. The extension of this is therefore that in unstable angina, it's unlikely that thrombolytic therapy is going to work. Now here are the data on bundle branch block. This is the control, this is the active, and you can see there is a big difference in favor, and the size of difference, 22% down to 17%, is similar to what you see with ST elevation. What this really means is what all cardiologists know. If you've got a good story and somebody's got bundle branch block, it's just the bundle branch block just makes the ECG hard to read. So now these are the data not to 6 hours, bundle branch block or ST elevation, because that's where we're seeing the benefit. Early, we're seeing about a 13.5% mortality down to 10.2%. We're seeing a slight excess in the early risk. Now look at 7 to 12 hours. Let me go back for a minute. You can see slight excess early, but by about 3 or 4 days, the curves start to diverge. Looking at 7 to 12 hours, it's taking nearly 10 days for the curve to start diverging, and the excess risk is greater. Look at 13 to 24 hours. Look at the excess risk is greater, and it takes nearly 2 weeks for the curves to cross over, and then you start seeing a later benefit. So what seems to be happening is that the early hazard is time dependent. Okay, now let's look at that same data, exclude deaths in the first day, and you're getting 9% down to 6%, about a 1/3 reduction. 7 to 12 hours, again a clear benefit. 10.5% down to 7%, about the same size. And very late treatment, 10.2 versus 7.5%. So once you exclude the early hazards, the later benefit is independent of time. This is again totally contradictory to the way we thought about thrombolytic therapy just a few months ago. So yes, the net benefit is time dependent, but it depends on the combination of an early hazard, that is time dependent, and a late benefit, which is independent of time. So if we can understand the early hazards, we might be able to improve the benefits of thrombolytic therapy. So this is the risk, this is a summary of what I just told you. Now the same thing, I'm not going to do this slide by slide, but I'm going to now show the same data by age. People under 65, 65 to 74, over 75. Control group in all 3 cases. You can see how as people become older, they have much, much higher mortality. But in each of these 3 groups, the net benefit is the same. But look at the early hazards. It is somewhat greater in this group, in the oldest group, compared to this group or this group. Yet, overall, there is a benefit. In fact, the absolute benefit seems to be about the same. If you remove the early hazards, the absolute benefit is actually greatest in the elderly compared to the middle age. And I'm going to define middle age over 65. I'm sure many of you will be pleased with that. and under 65 here. So you can see that again, if we can do something about the early hazards, we might increase the value of the sorts of patients who could receive thrombolytic therapy and benefit. Late patients could be benefited, and the elderly can be benefited, and these are both certainly high-risk groups. Okay, so now compared to the paper that I gave you in your handout, this is what my revised expectations are after the new data have come in. Definitely treat people between 0 and 6 hours. 7 to 12 hours probably, especially if there's clear-cut ST elevation, bundle branch block, and the patient is high risk. 13 to 24 hours, there is a possibility of benefit, but at this stage, there is certainly a potential of a fair amount of hazard. So we need to keep our mind open. But age, on the other hand, the benefits are seen at all ages. This is the net benefit. It takes into account the excess early hazards, which is greater in the elderly. Age itself, therefore, is not a contraindication to treatment. And in fact, if we find a way to overcome the early hazards, the benefits may well be greater in the elderly. Right, this is the first part of my talk, and I'm going to pause here. I know most of this is probably new. I think the second half, is the more interesting part. And that's the bit that hasn't got into the newspapers. Yep.
Identify those factors that might come up pretty early, for example, stroke.
It doesn't explain everything. I'll show you data on what it might be in a minute, but we'll come to that.
Is the bundle branch block new onset, or do you have any data on that?
No, because many of the people don't have a previous ECG.
I made a comment that I don't have any stocks with Genentech, so let me make that comment with that premise. My major problem with ISIS studies is the very loose criteria for admission into the study. I understand the basis you're saying, like you folks are to treat. In 21 different countries, different doctors, different communities treat people very differently. So when you put together apples and oranges and grapefruits and watermelons, you come out with a crush that is so difficult to understand. And I know numbers can hide multitudes of sins, but still numbers can also hide some real truths and some data. So I have a major problem with ISIS just on that basis. Originally, when I was at UCLA, I refused to participate in ISIS merely because the entry criteria were very loose. They didn't care. 1 EKG, they really didn't care whether the diagnosis was finally confirmed to be MI or not, whether enzymes are positive or not. And a lot of patients on clinical criteria can be initially thought to be MI, don't have MI. And some people may loosely treat them, some may not. And I think I have real concerns about jumping a whole host of numbers merely because of that. I think that the scientific value of a study is really dependent on how good the data gathering and how good the exclusion criteria. And if you don't, numbers alone doesn't, to my knowledge, doesn't take away the...
But I'm glad you emphasized with the word my knowledge. I think there is a major, this is the first time I've heard people being referred to as apples, oranges, melons, and crushes. So, right. I think there's a fundamental misconcept in what you said, and I say this without trying to be rude. I'm just wanting to put that very clearly up there. And this is not just with ISIS. This is with the concept of randomized trials, and it's not an issue of numbers. It's with the design of trials. The main reason we need randomized trials is because no two patients are alike. You can never get a homogeneous group. So, the only way you can get two groups to be similar is not by matching them, because we've gone through this for several decades, is by randomizing and then ending up with approximately similar types of patients. So number one, the internal comparison in any of these randomized trials, like ISIS or anything else, is internally valid. There's no problems there. The second issue is, although ISIS did tell people, look here, you as a clinician make a diagnosis of what you think is an MI and get the ring. Number one, that is the real world. And we want an answer that is applicable to the real world. Each one of us as physicians makes our own diagnosis, And it's ridiculous to say that people who've gone through many years of training and fellowship and practice need to be told how to diagnose an acute MI. Sure, certain times they're going to be wrong and certain times they will be right. The third aspect is although you do have broad, ill-defined criteria, there are enough characteristics measured, for instance, ST segment elevation, duration of pain, age, and you can subdivide patients by whatever characteristics you choose to do so that you get more homogeneous groups. And that's the sort of data I showed you. And in ISIS-3, no matter which way you look at the data, and the same thing is true in GC2, ST elevation, no ST elevation, early, late, age, the results are identical. So even if you do have concerns with that aspect, that is not a confounder in the trial results or its applicability. So I don't really think that applies. And actually, more and more people in the world are beginning to realize that so-called rigid entry criteria for trials has been total nonsense for the last few decades. In fact, more and more NIH trials now, we're going away from that concept. So, it's a matter of people who have not been involved in trial design and understanding trial design, throwing stones. And, we clearly disagree. Yep.
One of the factors that ISIS-3 has been criticized is if you look at mortality rate, P2B is 5% across the board. ISIS-3 is 10% across the board. How can you get twice the mortality rate?
That's a very good question. In fact, you've got to compare the entry criteria of the two studies. TIMI 2B excluded people with age over 75 years. Remember, they had to get TPA, be alive up to a certain number of hours after getting TPA, and then be randomized. So the types of patients you're talking about are very different. I showed you from the first slide that a substantial proportion of their deaths is in the first 12 hours. Now, one of the hospitals in TIMI 2A and 2B, the William Beaumont Hospital, took all its patients that presented to hospital, and they looked at its criteria. When it took the patients who entered had TIMI 2B criteria, they had a 3 or 4% mortality. When they took the whole group, it was a 10%. So the differences between TIMI 2 and ISIS or GC is patient selection. It's not, you're just comparing, perhaps, from what Dr. Shah said, apples and oranges, if I may use that terrible word. So they're really non-comparable. Again, there are differences in whether people with previous strokes could get it, people with previous MIs. I mean, there's a whole host of differences in entry criteria. And if you start matching them, then immediately it becomes apparent they're very different sorts of patients.
You mentioned that the lean infarction rate was lower for TPA streptokinase and theorized that if we added heparin, venous heparin, increased lean infarction probably would have a greater effect on the streptokinase group.
But there's more room for improvement, let's put it that way.
Yeah, but isn't it also possible that heparin would have a differential effect on lean infarction between the two agents and in fact be more powerful in reducing lean infarction in TPA?
It's possible, but I'll show you some data in the second half of this game where actually the reverse is what the available data seems to suggest. And I don't believe that, although that's what the data show, I'll point out why I don't believe that. Ultimately, I think it's going to have the same effect to TPA or streptokinase.
Any data on mixed protocols like TPA plus SK or TPA plus urokinase versus single fibrinolytic agent trials?
There are limited data from two sources that seems to suggest that the mixed protocol, TPA plus urokinase is the common, and then there's been TPA with streptokinase, you get a higher patency rate than with either agent alone, or you get a lower re-inclusion rate. These are very small trials, and really the Gusto trial is going to try to test it, and that will be a useful answer to